Hello there, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Psyched to be with you. Episode 4, Season 4. This is going to be a big one. Strap up, get a beverage, indulge your ears. Let's settle in. It's going to be great. I'm excited. I hope you are as well. My very special guest, introduce yourself. Let's get into it. I want to extract all that I can from this conversation.
Wonderful. Yeah. So hi, I'm Laura Kate Dale. I go by Laura K Buzz online. Um, I do all sorts of things on the internet, ranging from writing books about the joyous experiences of trans and autistic people, through to video game reviews, through to accessibility content on YouTube. A little bit of everything. I make a lot of online content. That's me. Hi.
So there's a feast for us to enjoy here. And, really part of what I like to do is go a bit beyond you just what we do. But
Yeah.
let's break down what you do, because you said that very blasé. But writing
Yeah.
books is not easy. How do you find being an author?
Being an author is something I stumbled into almost by accident, and that I find very rewarding but pretty terrifying as a creative pursuit. I was living in a house share maybe 5 or 6 years ago with someone who happened to get a publishing deal from a publisher, who happened to ask, "Do you know anyone else who would like to write a book?" And that was how I got into the world of writing books, was living with someone who said, "Have you ever had an idea for a book? Because I know a publisher looking for new authors." Um, and going into that, I'd never really considered writing books. I loved the idea in that, as someone, like, I got my career in writing starting doing a lot of news and reviews writing about video games. And for as much as I love talking about my opinions on video games, it all feels very intangible. It all feels like you put up a review of a game, and a week later there's another big video game, and that review is completely forgotten to history. It's had its moment and it's gone. And there's something about writing a book where it is, at the end of it, there's gonna be this tangible thing that will be out in the world that feels like it persists a bit longer. And that is exciting and validating, and also terrifying, because anything you commit to page is on physical page and will stay there that way forever. And as such, it feels like if you write a book poorly, it's also going to stick around longer. But yes, I've written several books at this point. I wrote a memoir about living as both trans and autistic, called Uncomfortable Labels. I wrote a silly yet serious coffee table book of video game character butt reviews called Things I Learned from Mario's Butt. Um, I
Okay.
I wrote portions of and edited an anthology called Gender Euphoria, which was myself and 17, I think, other trans, non-binary, intersex writers sharing positive, joyous, real-life stories of being trans, and sort of reveling in the gender-related joy that doesn't get talked about a lot in the trans community. I wrote a children's book called My Dysphoria Monster, which is a children's book designed to approach gender transition in child approachable language. It is a book, as a child, I needed to have language for what I was going through, but I hope it can also be useful for trans people who have young people in their life with questions about what's going on. I'm trying to be that kind of resource. Um, I published a novel with my wife recently called Who Hunts the Whale, which is a satirical novel set in a pastiche of big AAA video game development studios. Definitely not going to name any ones I was parodying in particular.
Any names
About
or perceptions of reality is completely by chance.
oh yeah, it is purely a coincidence that the big budget video game they're working on is called Call of Duty. I don't know what deliberate choice you think I made there.
That's an
Uh,
excellent title for a game, though. That's really good.
right. So yeah, and most recently I had a book called Stories of Autistic Joy, which was like gender euphoria but autistic people's positive stories. So that is a whole bunch of books I've done in the last 5 years, apparently.
And I'm going to kind of use this as a stepping stone to then ask about your accessibility work, because I feel like
Yeah.
part of the problem around being any sort of minority person is that like most things in the news, it tends to always be negative, right? You don't get enough good stories, or if you are, they are kind of that like fetishization of uplifting kind of story, right?
Yes.
Um,
Yes, that wonderful term disability porn that gets thrown around.
yes, that was the phrase
Or
I was trying to think of.
inspiration porn, that's the one I'm looking for.
That's the one. And it's how did you kind of find really wanting to focus on those positive elements?
Yeah. So as I said, a lot of my early work in writing was very traditional, just reviewing video games and writing news about video games. And there's a few problems with that when you do it long term. First of all, as I said, it feels like it sort of happens and like it's not usually going to have much of an impact, and then the world moves on from it. But the other problem is that the video game industry over the last few years has gotten really, really depressing to focus on as a career. Looking at like stories of repeated abuse within game development studios through to this year, constant layoffs right across the industry. It is not an industry that's easy to get excited about. It is not an art form that is easy to feel like it is deserving of the love many of us have for it when you look behind the scenes. And like that really was something I struggled with for a while. I was maybe like 6, 7, 8 years into doing this full time writing about video games, and I was just like, I at times I don't enjoy it, and at times I don't feel like what I'm doing is substantial and is going to have an impact. And around the start of 2020, I had a real long sit down and tried to go, what do I love about games, and why do I want to talk about games, and what is it that I want the stuff I do about games to mean going forward, and what can I do that feels meaningful? And the answer to that I found was focusing on accessibility, in that it's something that can tangibly be worked on. It's a space where even if I have criticisms of a game, those are criticisms that can be actionably discussed, that could make games better for myself, for other people, for people who don't need them today but going forward. Things that could help make the industry better than it is today. I have had difficulties with games as long as I've played them, as is the case with many disabled gamers, and I really held off on talking about it for a long time because, as you're probably well aware, the internet is not great about people with disabilities in the gaming space. The gaming space can be pretty rough sometimes.
I mean, just the internet, am I right?
The internet generally is pretty bad. Gaming is like specifically kind of rough. But it was nice to start having a space to go, there are things that I think could be better with games, and it's not that I hate games that makes me say that. It's the fact that I love games and I want as many people to be able to play them for as long as possible, as is possible. And I think there is something very joyous in feeling like you're doing something to make an art form you love more be able to be something people can access.
And I think it's your gaming is so massive. It's the biggest form of media in the world, and it comes up a lot on this show, obviously, because I'd like to bang on about it, but it truly like why aren't more people able to enjoy games? It's a question I feel like we don't have a good enough answer to.
It's one of the only art forms I think out there that has a skill barrier to entry. And that is something that our industry has taken far too long to go, what can we do about that? This sort of assumed level of, these are just things that you need to be able to do, or this art form is just shut off from you, in a way that, like, few other art forms really get shut off quite as much.
What do you mean I don't have to get good to enjoy a painting or a film? Like,
exactly. Like, if even in other art forms, like I think other art forms have really like understood you need to make accommodations so that like it is for the greater good, to make sure that as many people as possible can experience the art you make, and be that in the form of like audio description guides at museums for describing paintings, through to having subtitled screenings in cinemas through to books being available as audiobooks. Other art forms have recognized we have limitations to our art form being accessible, and people should be able to come into our world and see. Like, I've never understood the video game industry looking at the rest of art and not going, we should be like them, in that surely we want as many people as possible to see what we did and to enjoy what we made.
It's definitely an interesting kind of almost like insular level of like gatekeeping, right? Like, oh well, we don't need to because we already have such wealth and prosperity. Like, too much power is what makes evil empires, and I'm saying that as someone who comes from England, so you know what I mean.
Yeah, as another English person, yeah. Um, yeah, I think for a long time the video game industry had a couple of problems where, like, part of it was we have such like, we are making so much money, we don't need to be going out of our way to try and seek a larger audience. I think for a long time there was this sort of built-in assumption that certain accessibility tasks just weren't doable. There was a lot of our industry's history where problems were just written off as inherently inaccessible, and that was just how it is. And that is a very self-perpetuating belief. If you tell yourself there isn't a solution to this accessibility problem, that lets you wash your hands of taking the time to think about solutions.
Mm-hmm. And I do hate to date the episode too much, but I feel like now is a really good time at the time of record. And I'm sort of most familiar with yourself through your accessibility work, through sort of access and those type of networks. But with the big jump recently of the PlayStation accessibility controller, we are now beginning to see game companies want to make a change. How do you feel
Yeah.
we are now, and where do you think we can go in the future?
So a thing I talk to with people outside of accessibility is I don't think people outside of the space realize quite how fast things have moved. I started like regularly making content about accessibility in like the start of 2020, and if you jump forward to like, I think it was like May or June when The Last of Us 2 came out, it really did light a fire under the games industry in terms of the speed with which progress has been made. And I think a lot of that comes down to the praise that that game received for being thorough and well thought through and proactive about talking about its accessibility. And then award season comes around, and a lot of awards specifically note the efforts made on accessibility. And that really did sort of point a lot of companies towards, this is something we can be praised for caring about. And as much as it sometimes feels like it's an uphill battle and like there's still a long way to go, even compared to just then, like halfway through 2020, now I would argue more big AAA video game developers are actively making efforts in accessibility than, those outnumber the companies that are really dragging their heels. And I think that is a very good sign for momentum in the industry. We can point to specific companies that are not doing a great job at keeping up with what are fast becoming standards.
Mm-hmm.
But I would much rather point to the fact that we do have companies that are starting to create what might someday be standardization of accessibility in the games industry. Even if, like, right now it's not an official thing, it's not something sanctioned, you can look at individual publishers and go, if I pick up a first-party PlayStation game, I can pretty confidently rely on the fact that it will probably have high contrast mode. If I pick up an Xbox first-party game, I can pretty confidently rely on it having, a lot of like the standards done correctly. And there will obviously be exceptions. Things like Starfield came out this year and was like a weirdly big drop down compared to Xbox's usual published output. But you look at PlayStation, Xbox, and Ubisoft in particular, I think each of them is creating a set of settings that most titles from most of their teams are reliably doing.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think, like the biggest thing this industry needs is this idea of standardization and coming to an understanding of, we need to make progress and then consistently do the things we've learned how to do. And the fact that a lot of those things are starting to become standards, like at the very least, most or a far larger number of games today than a few years ago have subtitles with good customizable sizes, with speaker tags, with opacity of backgrounds behind subtitles. Things like being able to scale your UI, having button remapping access within games. These are all things that have gone from being rarities to being expectations, at least within the companies that are doing them, and that makes me very positive about where we're going. I think 3 or 4 years from now we will be at a place, and this is me being extrapolating. I hope 3 or 4 years from now we are at a point where if a game publisher still hasn't gotten on board with the current accessibility trend, they are going to be a notable outlier worthy of pointing to. Because I think where we're at now is if a game is doing accessibility right, that is worthy of praise and that is newsworthy. I think another 3 or 4 years, we might get to a point where this game released without accessibility, this big budget game, is notable. And that's that tipping point I hope we're heading towards, where pressure from the rest of the industry is like, this is what we should be doing, get on board.
I think it's you want to remain hopeful, and I think games are generally adding features, and as you say, it's easy to kind of point fingers and go, this this was great, this wasn't great, but
yeah,
being on that precipice of change, I don't know why I buffered my words there, but being on the precipice of change, I think is exciting. I do agree. I think we are very close to producing a space where disabled gamers are being much more welcomed into the space.
I think that is proven true by the number of companies that are making more efforts to hire dedicated in-house staff who focus on accessibility. The increase in work availability for accessibility consultants, even just in small things like when the PS5 and Xbox Series consoles released a few years back, so many small accessibility focused creators that I follow were given review hardware in advance of those consoles releasing, something I don't know of ever happening before. And things like that, making sure that creators who might not have a huge audience but who are have insights that are really important for developers being reached out to and being seen as important parts of the conversation around games is signs that we are making that kind of progress, and that is really reassuring to see.
So I'm gonna flip all this on its head because I'm interested to learn about you, Laura. So how did you find your way into this? Because I feel like we just like I was just reviewing games and stuff, but how did you get from there to here? What was it that drove you? How might you direct someone else to follow that same path?
Yeah. So I've always known I liked talking about games. If anything, I like talking about them more than I enjoy playing them to a certain degree. And that's been the case as long as I can remember. From a very young age, I really struggled with social communication with other people. I felt very isolated growing up, autistic. I struggled to make connections. And one of the very first things I found as a point of connection with other people was video games. I remember growing up right at the peak of when Pokemon was exploding in popularity, and I had a real head for remembering numbers and facts and statistics, which was a very useful thing when people in my class wanted to know what level a Pokemon learned a certain move or how it evolved or whatever. And I have very positive early associations with playing video games and talking to people about video games, and that being a way I could connect with people. And I always knew that there were people whose job was to talk about video games. I remember being 15, 16 and listening to IGN's Nintendo podcast while I was going to and from school, and sort of abstractly knowing that's a job people do. But it's not a thing I ever seriously considered myself. In terms of getting into it as a career, I left school with basically no qualifications. I really, really struggled with school, and ended up doing a supermarket job that I was really struggling with. that was a sensory nightmare, dealing with a lot of people. It was not going well, and I needed something engaging to do in this job that really wasn't providing much stimulation. And for me, that was starting to write about video games. I would have a little notepad next to me at the till at work where I would try and come up with titles for articles I could write. And then I'd go home after a shift and sit and write them and put them up for free on the internet on the little blog. And a few things came together at the right time and worked out well for me. I was lucky enough to get a couple of bits of freelance work with a couple of notable websites early on. I'd done enough unpaid writing of my own that like a couple of bits had been noticed, and I was able to start getting some freelance work. But the big thing for me was I ended up losing that supermarket job pretty unexpectedly. I came out as trans. That was not received well. I cannot prove the two things are connected, but after a few years of working at this job with no issues, within a couple of weeks of me coming out, I no longer had a job, and you know how it is. You can't prove it, but
Coincidence? I think not.
yeah. And it just so happened to time up that I got asked by a gaming content creator on YouTube, James Stephanie Sterling. They dropped me a message and they were like, "I really enjoy your work. I've seen some things you've written. Would you like to be on a podcast that I'm making?" And I at the time thought they were just asking me to guest on a single episode. I was like, "Oh yeah, I'll come on an episode." And we sit down to record, and they're like, "No, you're one of the hosts." I was like, "Oh, okay." And this was someone with a considerably larger audience than me. And I realized like this was my moment if I was ever going to grab one. So I set up a Patreon and said to myself, I'll give myself a month. If I can make enough money on Patreon that I can scrape through a month, if I can scrimp and save and survive through a month on this, I'm going to make this my job. And that first month, just about, like, it was very tight on budget, but it was enough that I could live on, and I never looked back. From there, a lot of my early work was for a website called Indie Haven that I ran with a series of other unpaid writers that were looking to get our writing samples up together. The way we looked at the website was we were trying to make it a place that looked at indie games, and this is like 8-9 years ago, with the kind of depth of reporting coverage that big AAA games got. We wanted to like give little games that same sort of front and center spotlight. We did a lot of interviews with developers, and that was a really nice opportunity to network with people in the industry. And that segued through a couple of other places I wrote. My samples there ended up getting me. I was UK editor at Destructoid for a while. I was news editor at Kotaku UK for a while. I've written for various places freelance, and then I eventually settled into the industry is a bit depressing. Here I am at accessibility content.
So it's a joke that, you know, I'm pretty sure someone has a bingo card and does tick it off, but I flare it with all my guests at some point during the episode. So do pardon that here. It's purely professional, if you will. But how does it kind of feel to, as someone from the outside, I see yourself as very much like the finished article. You're the type of, you know, creator that I think like that's where I would want to be. You know, that type of level. How do you kind of manage that against your own expectations of further growth?
It is always difficult to balance that, because I am someone who is very work driven and who is always focused on what's that next big thing I want to do and what's that next milestone I want to hit. And when you have that kind of that mindset, it can be really easy to fall into I'm not far enough in my career, I'm not doing enough. It's very easy to fall into that imposter syndrome, or to not take
Imposter syndrome.
seriously
Never
what
heard
you
of it.
right. It's very easy to feel like everything's still ahead and not enough's done. And I've had to make a real effort over the last few years to like have those moments where I stop and go, if I told my 16-year-old self that this would be where I'm at today, that this would have been my job for as long as it is, how excited would 16-year-old me be? I'm trying to hold on to that,
Mm-hmm.
because when a career like happens in small little bits and tiny bits of work that all are very gradual, it can be really easy to forget, like, I've gotten to write about games for 10 years now, and I want to keep doing it for as long as I can, and that is exciting. And I need to. It's important to remind myself how far I have come, rather than just going, yeah, but I want to do that still. I want to get up there. I want to keep climbing.
To examine that a bit more, because I think I'm guessing
Mm,
you don't have to like confirm directly, but I feel like we were kind of growing up around the same time where I remember I was really excited about games and maybe wanted to work in games, but was very much told
mm,
the people that are doing it have been doing it for 20 years, they're going to do it for another 30, and then indie games
yeah.
happened, right? So I remember
Yeah.
being very dissuaded from even like considering it as a potential avenue. And then to now be here,
Mm.
and I always tentatively joke that I'm like game industry adjacent. I don't count myself as quite in there just yet, to sort of then be there now when there was that kind of yeah, but don't put all your eggs in that basket.
Yeah, I definitely did have the same sort of experience. As someone that, like, I failed my English exams, I have very poor. I very much struggle with spelling and grammar. I rely on the work of wonderful editors to make my work passable in that regard. Um, Coming from that background, I was very much encouraged. Like, you're not good at the letter grade says you're not good at writing, because of your technical aspects, and surely everyone wants to do this career, so like, it's a long shot, don't aim for a long shot that might not happen. um I had a lot of that going in, and it's it's tricky. I understand, like, I think about my how my mum responded to me getting into this line of work a lot, in that she was very much that person who tried to dissuade me from it, and she's very, very supportive now that I'm successfully writing. But I look at that and I go, I understand entirely why she was the way she was about me doing writing, because the first like 2 or 3 years of me writing was, I was making no money and staying up till like 2, 3 in the morning before a 6 a.m. shift to get my writing done. That, like, there was long periods where like maybe 20 people would read a thing I'd written, and I would be absolutely flagging as a result of it, of trying to get it done. But sometimes you just kind of start doing a thing and go, I know it's a long shot, but it's what I want to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for me, I hadn't felt that passionate about anything else I'd done in life. I had gone through a lot of life struggling to find motivation and struggling to feel like I had a thing that might be my thing. And when I found it, I was like, I don't care how long I have to spend doing this for no money. I'm gonna do it, and hopefully I can make a living off it someday. But if I can't, I still want to do it for the sake of doing it. Because, like, the way I've always felt about like video game writing when done well is, I when I love a piece of media, there are two things that I want to do. I want to help other people find out what I loved about it and convey the things that were positive to me. But then, even past that, I want to go read other people's opinions. I love soaking in other people's enthusiasm about things I like, things that they like that I haven't heard of. That sort of exchange of, how do you distill your passion about something in a way that other people can read and go, you sound really excited about this, I want to give it a try.
Mm-hmm.
That has always felt really magical to me, that idea that you can convey a such a big piece of art into something tangible that someone can go, I understand why this might be for me. It gets me really excited.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, even if I can't make this a career, I gotta try it though. Gotta try.
So this is, listen, I'm not gonna say that this podcast has any necessary power to it, but I have had previous guests manifest certain things on the show that have then come to fruition. So take that as you will. But what is your next goal? What is your next milestone? Because this is going to go out, Jeremy bear me a few months after we record it. I'm planning. But what would you by the time this goes out? What are you hoping to have achieved? What's that next goal?
So the next big goal in my head is it's pretty big picture. It's still probably 6 months or so away, but in June of 2023, I put together for the first time the Access Ability Summer Showcase, which was a 45-minute long sort of showcase during Summer Games Fest week, focused on games that had made an effort to be accessible, and putting them all together so that there was a space during that week where people could come and find out about cool games and know upfront, is that cool looking game that I've just found out about, is that going to be something I can actually play? And have answers to that upfront. And I was super proud of how the event's first year turned out. I am very proud of that showcase and how it turned out. And right now, the big thing I'm thinking about is I want that to be an annual event, and I want to step up on what that event can be, in terms of trying to record it in a slightly nicer studio space rather than in front of a green screen in my office, in terms of having conversations with some slightly bigger game developers to hopefully have some slightly bigger announcements than the first year had. Trying to build on what I think worked about that first event, which was in a lot of ways an event that came together at the very last minute and was an event I had no idea how to do the kind of thing I was doing and was learning it as I went. And I'm very much looking forward to, cool, I know how to do it now. How can I make it bigger and better? It was such a nice feeling of satisfaction when that showcase all came together, and I just got to sit and watch people get excited about a bunch of cool looking games I'd found from people who were like, here's all the things I've done to help make sure other people can play these. It was the highlight of my year, and it's a thing I want to make sure that project gets momentum and grows. I don't want to be stagnant with what I put out with that show in a year. Like in 2024, I would love for that to be maybe not just once in the year. Maybe if I can make it happen in the summer and then again in the winter, that would be really nice. Again, it's trying to take what worked and build it into something sustainable, I think, is my big goal at the moment.
I can feel it. I can see it happening. I'll be honest. I can see it. I can feel it. My last kind of I'm going to say business centered question, because I want to just learn more about you. I just love chatting with people. But what you've touched on passion a few times, but what is it that keeps you going? Because this is a challenging industry. You mentioned that there are difficulties for minority people as well. How do you manage to keep going against those barriers?
I think there's a couple of things for me. I have pretty bad ADHD, and I struggle to focus on any one thing for much time at all. And that is something I struggled with a lot earlier in my career, but it's something I've tried to harness as time's gone on. I do a lot of different projects. Like we've talked about, I do books and accessibility work. I do Dungeons and Dragons podcast, and
Nice.
I do all sorts of things. And in part, that's because my brain struggles to commit to just one thing and needs novelty, but it means that if I am having moments where I struggle with passion for one segment of what I do, I have other work I can be doing. I have passions that, if an area of the industry is getting a bit rough, I can devote a bit more time to something else I do and keep something that I'm passionate about in the mix until whatever's been a bit rough comes back around. But beyond that, yeah, the industry gets a bit rough sometimes, and it can be hard to love video games all the time. It feels like right now there is barely a week that goes by where I don't find something and go, I love this piece of art. Oops, turns out it was made by someone terrible. It's a pretty consistent thing. But the thing I try and remind myself of is, why did I get into this? And for me, it was love of games as an art form. And I try and remind myself sometimes about the art that I love in games, because the interactive nature of video games is something really magical. It is something that can lead to emergent stories that people share with each other because their experience of a piece of media was slightly different to someone else's. It can lead to novel ways of telling stories where your interaction is inherently part of what the story is. I had a conversation with someone the other day who never finishes games. They find an area they love and just stay there. And I'm like, that's something you can't really do in any other media form. Is I like this bit, I'm going to wring more enjoyment out of it. You couldn't be like, I enjoy this scene in a meadow in a book, I'm going to find more content here. Um, Video games are a young art form and a one with a magical amount of potential. The sheer amount that they can be customized is something that gives a lot of potential for making them a very accessible art form if that effort's put in. And I try and remind myself, at its best, video games can be something truly unique, and it's rare to be around, I think, for the birth and infancy of an art form in the way that we are for video games right now. If we look at them compared to any other form of media, the closest we have is cinema, which has, nearly a 50 to 100 year lead. We are such a young art form that it feels like a magical time to care about critiquing video games, because there is still so much room for them to grow into whatever they're going to eventually be. I remind myself, like, be passionate about the fact that this art form is still growing and we can still shape what shape it will settle into.
Sorry, I found myself very just completely enchanted by what you were saying there. You speak with a delightful eloquence, and your energy really carries that forward. Um, my brain is buffering the next question. So this is now we're going to change track ever so slightly. But
Hmm.
what I'm and this has become one of my go-to questions as I get to speak to more industry professionals. But because you work with games or on games, how does that
Hmm.
impact your enjoyment of games when you're not working?
It definitely has an impact. I've heard the phrase said before, if you do what you love for work, you'll never work a day in your life. And I think that is very much incorrect. You will never not be working. If you turn the thing you love into work, you will be working constantly. I don't think it's a surprise necessarily to say it's hard to turn off a critic brain. Often when I am playing a game that's not strictly for work, I will still have that little voice in my head going, yeah, but make notes about that. Remember that. Remember these facts that might be important if you did a review. Um, and that does inherently have an impact on how you enjoy a piece of media. Um, it's harder to have that guilty pleasure turn off your brain. Don't think of, like, well, this thing is objectively bad about this game, but I don't mind it, so I won't worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you end up cataloging those things. Like, a vague example, I have recently been playing a game called In Stars and Time.
Mm-hmm.
It is one of my favorite video games I have ever played, and personally I thought it was fantastic, but I have to talk about it with a caveat of, there is a deliberately repetitive looping section in the middle of that game that serves a purpose but is going to annoy a lot of people. It didn't bother me, but I can't not think about the fact that it is going to turn people off of playing that game, because I have to go through it in this sort of critical lens. And for me, the way I try and deal with that is I occasionally give myself video games where I'm like, I am not going to talk about this one for work. I will
Mm-hmm.
pick a video game, and there's nothing specific to it. I just get the gut vibe sometimes where I'm like, this game is just for me, and I give myself permission to not be a critic about this one. Off the top of my head, there's a mobile game called Florence,
Mm-hmm.
that's maybe 45 minutes long, about a romantic relationship between two people. I
Yes.
love that game. I give myself permission to never have in-depth thoughts about it. Sometimes you gotta carve out those examples where you're like, this one is just for me, and I give myself permission to not have intelligent thoughts about it.
So it's interesting you say that because I think my parallel to that is like, I do psychology, right? So I'm always thinking about like,
Mm,
could I use this for research, or oh, this would be fun to look at, and I
mm,
also do this. So I'm like, oh, this would be a great point to ask someone about. And I think the way I've kind of come to talk about it with my friends is that sometimes you want some brain trash. You want something that like, yeah,
Yes.
you can just consume and
Yeah.
enjoy, junk food for the
Yeah.
mind, and like this,
Yes.
this isn't to say that say Florence is a bad game or anything like that. It's just
No.
you need to tell your brain this is for another purpose. You're doing
Yeah.
this for something else, and that's really
Yeah.
important. We could get into a broader art versus entertainment debate, but fundamentally, like enjoying
Hmm.
what you enjoy is not a bad thing. Sometimes you don't
Yeah.
have to be super critical of everything. People who know me will know it's ironic for me to say that, but the principle is the same, right?
Yeah, it's the reason why I have certain things outside of video games that, despite the fact I could make online content about them, I don't, and I'm like I never will because those have to be offline things for me. One that I think about a lot is I enjoy building sort of Gundam model kits,
Mm-hmm.
little plastic sheets of robot parts I sit for hours and assemble. And I know there is a market for people who want to watch like Twitch streams of gently putting together robots, but I'm like, nope, that one's for me. I will sit and zone out for 6 hours in my living room and completely detached from reality, and then some robot legs exist now. And that's just for me. That's my time where I don't have to be having opinions. And I think it's important to have space for that when the media you're consuming becomes such a big part of your job.
And what else do you typically like to do to unwind?
Um, I love when able seeing live music. I am really enjoy live music, despite the sensory nightmare that can be to go and experience. I haven't been for a while because COVID kind of knocked my routine out, but I
Mm-hmm.
very much enjoy playing roller derby. And that used to be a big part of my routine. It's really nice to have found a sport that has that is so queer positive and particularly trans accepting.
For the
That
uninitiated, what and definitely
Yeah.
not myself. What is this?
So roller derby is the best way I can describe it is like rugby on roller skates. Um,
Okay.
you have a circular track and you've got two teams on the track, and each team has 1 point scoring player, and the rest of the players are basically just a brick wall. And you are trying to get your team's point scorer to do laps of the other team, to get past their big wall of players and do another lap. And it is a team sport about basically trying to create openings for your little point scorer to zoom through and then quickly lock up your walls again to physically stop someone else from the other team getting through on roller skates at high speed with a lot of collisions.
So it sounds like
It is
IRL Mario Kart, but with you're the
a,
cart.
a little bit, a little bit. But it is a sport that is like very trans positive, very queer, like a lot of queer women playing it, and it's a sport that allowed me to find a real sense of community. There is a real sense of family and connection and camaraderie that I'd never really experienced in sports before.
Mm-hmm.
That I was never very good at roller derby, but I very much enjoyed playing it with people and having that sense of community that came with it.
Mm-hmm. Is there any other sort of like key activities that you'd highlight that you like to enjoy?
I do a lot of board games. Me and my wife play a lot of board games. We have reached the point where we have two big shelves full of board games and still have board games exploding into the living room.
Nice.
Um, the first few months of lockdown during COVID, all we did with our free time was play. There is a board game called Pandemic about trying to stop the spread of an infectious disease around the world.
The irony
Um,
being, you probably did a better job than the UK government did.
it felt like it at times, but there's like a series of big campaign-based versions of that you can play with like a big story mode and changes across the map over multiple months. And that was like the first 6 months of lockdown for us, was just us every weekend being like, right, time to sit and strategize how we're going to stop diseases spreading around the world.
How we're gonna stop
We have
COVID-20?
Oh yeah, no, there was, I don't remember what the parody name was, but it was something to that effect. Um, yeah, I like having board games, as it's nice to have something with those sort of like game rules to think about that isn't just staring at a screen as much as I do in the week.
And I do think there's been this again boom in popularity of board games, right? Because I think a lot of people enjoy the tactile, very sort of engaging
Mm.
nature of like physical pieces. You know,
Oh, yeah.
I have no research to back that up, but that's
No,
my
no,
feeling, right?
I feel the same way about it. It's nice to like dedicate some space to this is what we're doing and like a tangible activity in that way. And um I I am a real sucker for deluxe versions of board games with very fancy, elaborate components. My wife's recently gotten into model painting, so we have lots of very detailed hand painted little models, and we have far too many games, but they're all lovely. I could never get rid of any of them. They're perfect.
Of course. I mean, why would you?
Of course.
You know, you might find that one occasion that's perfect to play it. You know what I mean?
Exactly. I might not play it often, but I need to keep it on the shelf.
Exactly. So I think, you know, like I think it's great to try and have these type of conversations. And one of the things I enjoy most about this is I love people. I'm fascinated by people doing psychology, but but I think it's great to when you are again, pardon me for framing you in this way, but someone who's like known for this thing and is a big name.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like it's really great to then learn what goes beyond your profession, right? We have such a tendency to be reductive and almost like have like those job/class kind of statements and not look
Yeah.
beyond those. Is there anything else
Yeah.
that you think people like should know about you? Like, is there anything else that you wish people did know before they approach your content? Maybe.
That is such a tricky question.
And it's not one that's in the list. I'm sorry. This is me chatting.
No, that is super okay. I'm just taking a second to think it through. One thing I used to do career-wise that I haven't really done in a while that I would love to do, like something I would love to do more of, is I used to do music reviews for a while. I used to have a little single page music column in the back of a UK video game, like a generic nerd culture magazine in the UK. I used to have a little one page music review column, and it's one of those things where I've not really had much opportunity to like talk in depth about music for a long time, but I love music. I love getting like really in depth on like a single track or a single piece of music and just getting real in the weeds about artistic choices being made in music. It's not something I have a lot of opportunity to talk about because when you sort of pigeonhole your career into like video games, that's what I do. You try and do things that aren't that, and the algorithm's like, that's not the thing people click on you for. But I really love just digging through hours of music trying to find something new I've never heard of that is weird and unique that I can latch onto and go, that's the thing I'm going to play on loop for the next like 5 hours because it's very interesting.
I resonate with that on a spiritual level. Laurie speaking my language. Have you been listening to anything recently that's been really sort of allowing you to
let me
explore?
Yeah, let me pull up my music I've been listening to recently. So I would love to talk about an album that I've been very into. The album is called Blouse Club by a band called Problem Patterns. This is this band's debut album. They're a sort of all-female punk band from Northern Ireland, whose debut album is like very shouty riot girl punk. It's very sort of like not too overproduced. It's very direct in its messaging, as a political album with something to say in terms of discussing the current state of UK politics, the topics such as the ways that the lesbian community is being weaponized against trans women, and
Mhm.
like actively going, do not do crimes against trans women in our name. There are some really interesting tracks on there about lesbian identity. There's some great songs directly tackling topics such as the fact that a lot of men seem to need a personal involvement in a woman to care about that woman's safety. It is a an album that is like not too long, but every track on it is like very direct and is making no attempt to like use subtlety to hide
Mhm.
what they're on about. And it is a very energizing impassioned album that's like it's the first time in a while I've heard a debut album from a band and quite so quickly gone, you have the makings of something really big. Like, you have the kind of energy that could fill a room very easily. And I'm very excited to see what other music they put out. It is an album that's really stuck with me this year.
You know, like you just got me thinking of like what was the last debut album that like I picked up, and like so I'm a bit of an old man. I only recently moved to digital streaming platforms like in 2023. I used to be like, well, no, I want to own it on CD and rip it and put it on my iTunes because I'm old. And
I
then
get it. I've been there.
but I say that, and then like I also have a vinyl collection. So like I mean,
Oh,
it's
same.
but like being able to stream music is actually very handy. Um, so and like I think debut album that I picked up, I think Holly Humberstone, Paint My Bedroom
Yeah.
Black. That was pretty good.
Uh, yeah, I don't know the album, but
But like yeah, like
yeah.
debut. I don't think I've heard that many debut albums. Weirdly.
It's a thing I like finding. I like finding debut albums where I can, because I love hearing like, what is your first foot forward for an artist? Like, what is that first statement you want to make? As like, this is, whether it's a little clumsy and a little underproduced perhaps, like, what is the core of what we're passionate about as a band? Because like, listening to a first album, you usually get a pretty good instinct of what is the driving emotion that drove you to start making music. And there is usually a lot of interesting things to be heard in that slightly not quite sure if direction hasn't been like refined yet initial direction sometimes.
It's possibly a bit of recency bias because at the time of recording, it's been the 20th anniversary. But I think one of the best debut albums I heard as it came out was Permission to Land by The Darkness.
Ooh, yeah.
Because that, the 20th anniversary reissue, you listen to it, it
Mm.
still hits. They've not deviated from that formula. Like, that's probably, I think, one of the best that like I heard when it came out in 2003. It's been the same since. Because I think
Yeah.
sorry, we're chatting music, and it's now becoming a music
No,
podcast.
I know. It's nice to have an excuse to chat music.
So one of my favorite bands is Fall Out Boy. If keen-eyed
Mm.
viewers will see a poster behind me with their emblem on, and they deliberately try and explore with each album. They try and take a concept or a
Yeah.
theme. The Darkness, don't necessarily do that, but like the core elements are
Yeah.
there. Big, hilarious rock
Mm.
tracks, and
Yeah.
there's benefits to both. But I think in terms
Yeah.
of debut album that has stayed very true to itself, I think Permission to Land is probably one of the best.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of the kind of band that can pull off that sort of like reinvention and like big change in direction between albums. And Fall Out Boy, I definitely recognize that in them. For me, it was My Chemical Romance. I was
Mhm.
that era, like that's the one of that era that latched onto me. I always really appreciated how every album they did was such a radical change in sound and style and genre and tone. And there are very few bands that can have like one album that is like recorded in an attic, quite just angry guitars, and one that is a weird sort of neon future space opera about the end of the world. It's like,
Mhm.
I love when you can listen through a series of albums like that and go, I can still hear the same band between these two wildly different takes.
So I'd love to then know what actually for you makes a good album.
Um, I've had to in recent years like make the effort to listen to albums as albums more, and I know that this is a thing a lot of people in the era of streaming do. Streaming's wonderful for finding new individual tracks, but so often you find them not in the context of an album. For me, like the best albums I've ever heard have consistency and a work as a whole piece that I can have that moment of listening to start to finish. I still think that I think a big part of the reason I love My Chemical Romance as a band so much is two of their later albums I think are really good examples of what I love in an album. The Black Parade, there is a reason that people talk about it as being as strong of a sort of rock opera as it was. It is a concept album through and through, and it does a lot of very creative work in terms of like telling a cohesive narrative throughout, and playing with different genre sounds that all feel part of one larger work. There's no point in that album, I think, where it feels like there is like a stop and something different is happening. But perhaps more so than that, like the album that came after it, Danger Days, True Lives of the Fabulous Killjoys, I think is a better concept album from that band. It start to finish tells this like very clear narrative of a group of rebels wanting to stand up against this sort of tyrannical status quo and being very over-promising with the wonderful adventure that standing up against tyranny is going to be. And then it goes through this real decline, like this real arc of here are the grim realities now that you've signed up for the rebellion of what rebellion means. Here is the losses starting to pile up and the having to go, are you still committed to this cause? Even now you are seeing it is not all fun and games and the struggle is happening. It crescendos with quite an intense peak of the tyrannical government is essentially going like, not only have we killed off most of your forces, but we have used propaganda to make it so that you are seen as terrorists for what you are trying to do, for this liberation you are trying to enact. And looking at like at that moment, what keeps you fighting when you have no chance of success and the world thinks you are doing something evil in even attempting to see change. What keeps you fighting? And that is one cohesive narrative that album has that goes through very well, that I think is like a beautiful piece of work. I certainly don't think that like that kind of concept status has to be there to make a good album. I think of other good albums I've listened to that really stick with me. There is an album called Chimes by an artist called Dessa, which is just back-to-back fantastic tracks where there is not a track on that album I would skip. And it is an album of very definitely isolated tracks in terms of topic, and that has a lot of creative switching around with genres, sounds, tempos, but manages to make that cohesive. I would never listen to an individual track off that album and not know it's from that album. And that kind of mastery of being able to do that many different things and have them feel cohesive and have some kind of identity that in isolation you can go, that's from that album, it's got that vibe, is something that is a real art form that is hard to quantify, but you know it when you hear it.
I mean, absolutely no notes. I was going to be like, yeah, I think some of my favorite albums start at one point and end at another, and I think parallels to sort of the two different types of concept. You know, again, full recency bias, but like for me, like Father John Misty comes to mind. You know, his most recent album, Chloe in the Next 20th Century, is about capturing elements from the previous 20th century and that 100 years in a concept that then goes, actually, like, we start at this point and then the other, versus, say, Pure Comedy, which was going to be a stage play at one point and starts with, like, isn't humanity awful? And ends with, yeah, humanity is kind of awful. We're kind of just specks on a speck on a speck and dealing with being a human between those 2 points.
I love a good track that can, like, a good album that can do like very direct storytelling and narrative sometimes. There's one that's just come to mind, an album called Once Upon a Time in Space by a band called The Mechanisms, that is a sort of pirate sea shanty reimagining of a bunch of classic fairy tales.
Nice.
And that sounds like it should not work. That is a clash of a few too many things, but it is a very cohesive album that's like you could imagine it put into a stage play and it would work very well. And like that, there's something, I love the idea of something that could have been a stage play that becomes just audio and can still work in
I,
that
I'm
way.
I'm reticent to say this because I know you're incredibly busy, but like I feel like I want a Laura like music podcast. I want some
I
dissection.
I did try and start one at one point, and it didn't work out. I had two hosts in mind I wanted to do it with, and schedules just didn't allow. But I wanted to do one, and maybe I still will at some point. That was going to be a essentially like a book club for music, and the idea was going to be
Oh,
each episode, each of the three hosts would bring like two or three tracks maybe that all of the hosts would listen. Like, it's your homework. We all hosts would listen to everyone else's two or three tracks, and we would sit and just chat about, here's the tracks we brought to the table this week for us all to listen to. And I want to do it still. It's just finding people that want to commit to doing it. I had a few people in mind and schedules just didn't work.
the idea of like an album club where like you do an episode.
Yeah.
As Snowy said, wait, obviously we're not committed to anything, but like the idea of like, okay, we listen to this album. We're now going to discuss it for however long. Do a dissection. We're going to talk about this album next. Go away and listen to it yourself and
Yeah.
come back with your
It's
thoughts.
it's a thing it's not that far removed from something like reaction content, but I love like deep dive dissection, watch along or listen along kind of content. I did one with some people for a while called the Crystal Clodcast, which was every week we would watch I think 4 episodes of Steven Universe, the animated show,
Mm-hmm.
and would just sit and have like a couple of hours roundtable about the couple of episodes we just watched. And I love having that, like, everyone's consumed the same piece of media and sat with it for a minute. Let's all talk about a thing that's fresh in our minds. It's nice to like not just be like, this is what I thought. It's like, we all experienced it recently. What are you thinking of it?
Sold. Sign me up. Let's get it. Like, I don't want to make more work for you. I do apologize.
I'd love for it to happen still. We'll see.
So I'm conscious of time. I don't want to keep you for too long.
That's all right.
So I'm gonna ask two of my favorite questions in every episode. The first one
Hmm.
is, if you had access to unlimited resources, expertise, time, whatever you needed, what's one blue sky project you would like to do?
That
The
is
music
a
podcast.
no. It's a tricky question because I feel like I'm in a place right now where I feel like I've done the Blue Sky project, which was for like the last like 2 or 3 years, the accessibility summer showcase has been that big project I wanted to do and wanted to make happen. In terms of like big picture stuff, I would love to have a like on a nice studio set in person with other people, a like regular accessibility in games video podcast with like a set cast of other creators talking about video games specifically through that lens, be it having roundtable discussions about news things that have come up, talking about games we've been playing very unapologetically through that lens, and having like a nice production value. Here is just a group of people chatting about game accessibility casually on a regular basis is something that I want to do more, because I love the times when I get opportunities to have conversations with other people about accessibility rather than just talking about it from my own perspective. And I would love for that to be a regular part of what I do, and find a way to have like a very polished, this is us just having our little roundtable chats on a regular basis, is something I would really love to do.
So this is a cheeky question, and I'm going to use it to bridge to my next one. But is there someone who you haven't that you would really like to work with? maybe on that type of project, but someone you haven't already that you'd love to work with?
It's it is a privilege to find that a hard question to answer, because I've gotten to work with a lot of people I've really wanted to work with over the years on things. There is a project I wanted to work on with someone once that never worked out, and I'd still love to really make happen. I was in discussions to do a big interview with Laura Jane Grace, the lead singer of the band Against Me,
Hmm.
that never panned out, but that is someone who I really owe a lot to, in terms of like their album Transgender Dysphoria Blues, I think, is like one of the key pieces of like shouty, protesty trans punk out there. I think it is a masterwork, but just generally, that is someone that like I've really wanted to just have an opportunity to sit down and chat with and talk creative stuff with, and finding an excuse and the schedule to do that is one that I would really love to do, like, generally.
Someone you'd like to go for a beverage with. Just
It's
sit
someone
down.
I'd like to just like really get into the weeds about creative stuff with, because there's a lot of questions I have about their creative process that I would just love to drill into. Um Outside of that, it's tricky. I've gotten to work with a lot of the people I've wanted to work with in the industry over the years, which is um a real privilege to have been able to do. Yeah, honestly, there's not a lot of people that jump to mind as I've not had a chance to work with, and I'd love to, and that is a weird realization to suddenly have.
And I love that. I think like that's excellent, and we should celebrate that. That shows that you're able to do these things and affect change. Which is massive. And that feeds into my next question, which is there someone that you would like to give a shout out to who you feel maybe doesn't get the recognition that they deserve, or someone you just feel like you want to give a little bit more love to, in a school appropriate
um,
way, obviously.
yeah, so a few people, like, it would depend on what day you ask me as to who I answer about this. There's so many wonderful people doing so much work at the moment. Ones that are jumping to mind, there is a wonderful creator in the accessibility space called Hello, It's Colo, is their social media handle. Does a bunch of very good accessibility content focused on mobility-based accessibility. Previously has been doing a lot of content with like foot-based controls, and is now starting to gain more with the PlayStation Access controller as a hands-based controller. That works really good. Um, Molly Evans put together a series of really good roundtable discussions around accessibility in July of 2023 that were some of the best stuff I've seen this year, in terms of like collating together a lot of really good voices to have very impactful discussions. I think that the whole series of those roundtables was really important, and I know that they have ambitions in 2024 to run a physical in-person accessibility focused event, and I think that this time next year a lot more people are going to be aware of what they're doing, and that they deserve a shout. um uh Other people, I'm gonna do a self-serving one. My lovely wife Jane, makes it can be found at Maniac Janiac on Twitter and other social medias. She's the person I co-wrote Who Hunts the Whale with. That book would not be what it is without her hugely important additions to it. But she also makes music under the name Bedroom Programmer. She makes a lot of electronic music. She publishes reviews of board games. I think that she does wonderful work, and would love if more people saw the things she creates. There's probably a whole bunch of other people, but those are the ones that
That's
jump to mind today.
That's fine. I love that. I'm here for it. You're weirdly enough, you had the second guest in a row to say their wife as one of the answers to that question, which I find is great. Your significant others show them some affection. It's good, and
I
doing
love
that
the I
live.
love this. Yeah, I love the art that my wife makes, and more people should know that she makes cool stuff.
I'm here for it. So one of my kind of final set piece questions is a bit of fun,
Hmm.
a little bit quick fire. You're going to a biome of your choice. I wouldn't. We'll go to a beach, for example. I'll be no problems. And you are going to take with you one film, one book, one album, and one game. If it comes as a collection, you're physically, digitally, you can have it. Everything will work magically. You'll have all the gear you need.
Yeah.
You can have a TV show instead of a film, or audiobook instead of a physical book,
Yeah.
etc. But what are you taking with you?
So I'm no good at remembering like long-term big picture favorite things of all time. A lot of my answers will be what I'm thinking about at the moment. Film. There is a fascinating film that I could rewatch several more times in a row right now called I think it's called Dave Makes a Maze, and it is a horror film in which a man has been left alone for the weekend, and he never completes projects he starts on, so he starts making a little cardboard maze in his living room, and his wife gets home and he's like, I'm lost in the cardboard maze in my living room. And she's like, what do you want about? You're being silly. She goes inside. It is infinitely larger on the inside than it is on the outside. Cardboard-based horror ensues. That film is visually stunning. It does so much creatively with its art form. It is a beautifully like textured, tangible film that does a lot with a little. And I could watch that film over and over trying to pick apart a lot of the visual design choices they made with that film.
It sounds
Um,
whimsical, and I love that.
it strikes the balance well between comedy and horror in that both mediums are essentially building up suspense and subverting expectation of how they'll pay off. And it's very good at knowing how to walk that line between those two payoffs for suspense. An album. I'm trying to think of a album that I haven't already talked about that I would take to that island. Honestly, no, I'm not going to fight myself on this. If I could take one album, it would be Chimes by Dessa.
Oh, excellent.
It is the if there's one album since I was like a teenager that has stuck with me, and I'm like, this is my favorite album that I wasn't 15 when I listened to. It's Chimes by Dessa. It is a very, very strong album full of like consistently well written, very empowering feminist anthems. There is a lot of very good tracks in there for trying to get yourself into a certain mindset, be it I am going to succeed and you're not going to stop me, or being angry at the state of the world in various regards, or just very good, heartfelt, soulful tracks. There is not a bad track on that album, and I love it very much.
Nice.
One book. I recently finished reading a book that is very short that I loved very much, called Poison for Breakfast by Lemony Snicket. Lemony Snicket is most known for having written the Series of Unfortunate Events books. But this is completely unconnected to those. This is a short story about a man who is eating his breakfast one morning and finds a piece of paper on the floor that says, "You've eaten poison for breakfast." And it is in part trying to solve the mystery of what has happened, who would have poisoned my breakfast, what has happened, but in part it is a ruminating on the creative process and a story about trying to explore creativity through the lens of limited time. It is a fascinating read that is not particularly long. I read through it in a couple of hours in one day, and I deeply enjoy a narrative that could be that tightly constrained, but tell that strong of a narrative.
I hate it when I get me poison mixed up with my milk in the morning.
Right. So easily done. So
We've all
easily
been there.
done. And one video game. I mentioned this one earlier, but right now this is the video game I am obsessed with. It's called In Stars and Time. It is a time loop adventure RPG where you are not the member of the RPG party who's like the big hero destined to save the day. You're sort of like with the destiny about them. You're not even like the most recent party member. You're number 3 or 4 they picked up on the way, and you arrive at this town right before the big bad's castle, like a day before the world is due to end, and you go and try and tackle the big dungeon, and you realize you are not strong enough to beat the big bad boss or save the day, and you die, and you wake up at the start of yesterday, and you have one little town and one dungeon and about a day or two to work out how to get strong enough to progress through this dungeon and work out why you're looping through time. It is a beautifully written narrative that, despite any problems with it, I think does a really good job of using the medium of video games and the fact that you have to be interactive with them to tell a really good story about being stuck in a loop that does not seem to be progressing and that you cannot seem to impact as much as you would like, and uses that to tell a really impactful story. I think it is a slightly flawed, but it is a masterpiece, and it's one that I binged through it in a few days. Every night I was going to bed telling my wife, like, oh, this happened in it today, oh, and I found out this and this was going on. And I finished it yesterday, and I'm already thinking about replaying through all of it again. So I'll take that with me and sit and play that for ages.
I think you'll have a good time. It sounds like it. So I then like to offer you, the guest, the chance to ask me a question, turn the tables upon myself. I've had the how's your PhD going? Please don't ask me that. And like I've been asked the biome question before, but anything else? Shoot.
Well, you know what? This has given me an opportunity to talk about bits of media I don't often get to talk about. What's a bit of media you love that you don't often have an excuse to just enthuse about, that you want to enthuse about?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm. It sounds a bit daft, but I'm probably gonna say a good audiobook. Like, I mean, I enjoy audiobooks because I'm a visually impaired person, so like they're genuinely sometimes easier than reading. But like because audiobooks have been picked up by the general mass market as more accessible than reading, some of them have really great production values. And like
Yes.
rightly or wrongly, I really enjoyed the work of Steve Coogan as Alan Partridge.
Mm-hmm.
It's a caricature which has really negative opinions. The joke is that some people listen to it and go, "This is absolutely correct," and other people like myself go, "This is a parody." And there's something about that the production value of it being read by the author in the character really brings a lot of joy to my heart.
I couldn't agree more. I love a good, well-produced audio book or audio drama generally. I love a good soundscape produced around a story. Not to throw another recommendation in, but there is if you enjoy horror, there is a podcast called the Magnus Archives that starts off as just like an anthology of standalone horror that eventually becomes a bit more connected. But that is one that I've really enjoyed for a long time because they do such a good job with that kind of audio design and the stuff that is not just the reading of the story. I love a good bit of like put on some good headphones and build a world around me.
That very much reminds me of Within the Wires.
Oh, I love the first season of Within the Wires is a masterpiece.
100%. I'm like a big
Yeah,
Janina Matthewson fan, which is how I got onto that.
yeah,
And like, yeah, the way like each season is its own anthology, but they kind of connect. Yeah, no spoilers. It's very
yeah.
good. Check it out.
Yes. For anyone who doesn't know, check out Within the Wires. The first season is about relaxation tapes, maybe as a method for learning about how to escape a place. I think is the broad strokes explanation, but it's very good.
It's very good and also genuinely quite disarmingly relaxing.
Oh yeah, it's not one I can listen to when I'm tired. I will just fall asleep to the whatever that is.
Okay, and then where are people best to find you online?
You can find me on most social media platforms that you would find a person on at Laura K Buzz. I'm still sticking around on Twitter just about Mastodon, Blue Sky, all those sort of things. TikTok, I post content over on TikTok. I post content on YouTube, still at Laura K Buzz. I have a Patreon that supports the work that I do, which is Laura K. Buzz. If you want to find the books, search Laura Kate Dale. You will find the books I do. Generally speaking, that's it. Look for Laura K. Buzz on platforms where a person might make internet content, or Laura Kate Dale if you want to find a book.
And you'll be there.
Yeah.
I love that universality. Having a guess, just like, yeah, I have the same name everywhere, and I've got to great pains to procure it.
My username has a weird enough origin to it that no one else went for it.
Nice. Well, on that, all I want to say, Laura, is thank you so much for joining me. I hope
Thank you
our
for
listeners.
having me. It's been lovely.
I hope our listeners and viewers have taken as much enrichment out of this conversation as I have. For our visual voyeurs, I shall flick over to the ending screen. But otherwise, thank you for listening. And as we always say on this show, look after your mind, body, and soul. Bye-bye.
Bye.